The Nigean soldiers laughed mockingly as human blood pooled on the rocky ground. More human colony ships burning through the sky toward near-certain death. Russell Ward took a swig from his flask, the bitter liquor burning his throat. The grizzled explorer leaned forward, his grey eyes flickering in the dim light, as he locked gazes with the eager recruits arrayed before him. The Nigeans were confident that their world was unconquerable, he rasped. Crushing gravity, toxic air, and hellish temperatures saw to that. When our colony ships arrived, fleeing an overcrowded Earth, those arrogant bastards thought we'd tuck tail and run. Russell huffed a laugh, shaking his head. They called us weak, said our soft, fleshy bodies could never withstand their planet, but they underestimated our resolve. Earth was dying. We had nowhere else to go. He gestured at the holographic star map floating above the table. So when General Pixis mobilized his forces against us, we did the unthinkable. Russell's eyes took on a faraway look. I remember standing on the bridge of the Intrepid as we punched through the atmosphere. Hull plates were glowing red, alarms blaring, crew shouting as the G-forces tried to crush us into paste. The recruits leaned forward, hanging on to his every word. Russell's face darkened, but that was just the beginning. When we landed and those airlock doors opened, all hell broke loose. The Nigeans threw everything they had at us, desperate to drive us off their precious homeworld. He fixed the recruits with a haunted stare. We fought them tooth and nail, knowing that retreat meant death in the void of space. We had to dig in on that accursed planet or condemn humanity to a slow extinction. So we bled and died, carving out a foothold one bloody inch at a time. Russell fell silent, his tail hanging in the air. The recruits glanced at each other nervously, the weight of their impending mission settling heavily on their shoulders. Russell's voice grew harsh as he recalled the brutal landing. Our ships were battered, hulls dented and scorched, but they held together. The moment we touched down, the bay doors opened and our forces poured out. Thousands of armored vehicles roared across the hellish landscape, soldiers in advanced environmental suits marching alongside them. He clenched his fist. We moved fast, securing a defensive perimeter around the landing zone. The Nigeans thought the planet's conditions would be our undoing, but we came prepared. Our gear let us operate in that toxic shitstorm like it was a sunny day on Earth. Russell spat on the ground. General Pixis was furious. The arrogant bastard couldn't believe we had the balls to land on his homeworld. He threw everything he had at us, confident that his warriors' strength and knowledge of the terrain would be enough to crush us. His eyes grew distant, seeing the battle unfold in his mind. It was a bloodbath. The Nigeans charged our lines, roaring their war cries. Our soldiers met them head-on, advanced weapons blazing. We fought in the choking fumes and searing heat, locked in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Russell's voice dropped to a whisper. We lost a lot of good men and women that day, but we held our ground. Our technology and sheer fucking willpower matched their strength and ferocity blow for blow. He fell silent, the recruits leaning forward, eyes wide. Then a grim smile touched Russell's lips. But that wasn't all. What the Nigeans didn't know was that we had an ace up our sleeve. A team of our best engineers and scientists had been working around the clock studying the planet's geology and biology. They found something that would change everything. Russell leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a mix of pride and sorrow. Our scientists, they were the real heroes. While we were up there getting our asses handed to us by the Nigeans, they were down in the labs, working around the clock. They discovered that the planet's core was filled with this stuff they called Nigeanium. Nasty shit, highly unstable. Russell's face darkened. We were on the brink of being overrun. The Nigeans were pushing us back inch by bloody inch. That's when the order came through. Deploy the device. He closed his eyes, reliving the moment. I watched from the command center as they activated it. The ground, it just started shaking. At first it was like a tremor, but then it grew stronger, more violent. The Nigeans, they had no idea what was happening. They just started falling, swallowed up by the earth. Russell's voice was barely a whisper now. It was like the planet itself was fighting back. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. It was pure chaos. The Nigean forces were thrown into disarray, crushed by their own homeworld. He shook his head, his eyes haunted. But it wasn't just them. Our soldiers, they were caught in it too. I watched as they fought their way through the destruction, trying to evacuate as many civilians as they could. The landscape. It was like something out of a nightmare. Scorched earth, molten rock, it was hell. Russell fell silent for a moment, the weight of the memory bearing down on him. In the end, only a fraction of our forces made it out. A handful of Nigean survivors too. We watched from the ships as the planet tore itself apart, collapsing in on itself. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. He looked up at the recruits, his voice heavy with emotion. That's the price of war, the price of survival. We did what we had to do, but the cost was almost too much to bear. The recruit sat in stunned silence, the gravity of Russell's words sinking in. Russell's voice grew heavy as he recounted the aftermath of the cataclysmic event. As our ships pulled away from the dying planet, we thought the nightmare was over. But then, we discovered General Pixis among the survivors. The recruits murmured in surprise, leaning forward. Russell nodded grimly. Pixis was in bad shape, barely clinging to life. Our medics worked around the clock trying to save him. But it was no use. His injuries were too severe. He took a deep breath, his eyes distant. I was there in the medbay when Pixis summoned Colonel Briggs. The general's breath rattled in his chest, his eyes glassy, but there was still fire in them, a defiance that even death couldn't extinguish. Russell's voice dropped to a whisper. With his last breath, Pixis told Briggs that the Nigians weren't the true owners of the planet. They had conquered it, centuries ago, from a species called the Colonizers, peaceful, advanced, and driven underground by the Nigians' brutality. The recruits exchanged glances, their eyes wide. Russell continued, his voice strained. Pixis said the Colonizers had been hiding, biding their time, developing technology to take back their world. But he refused to tell us where they were, said the planet's secrets would die with him. He fell silent, his gaze heavy with the weight of the revelation. The recruits shifted uncomfortably, the implications sinking in. Russell cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. Pixis died moments later, taking the location of the Colonizers with him. We were left with more questions than answers, wondering what other secrets the planet held. He looked up, meeting the recruit's eyes. But that wasn't the end of it, far from it. What we discovered next, well, let's just say it changed everything we thought we knew about the Nigians, the Colonizers, and the true nature of the conflict. Russell paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The recruits leaned forward, their faces a mix of apprehension and anticipation, waiting for the next revelation. Russell's voice grew heavy as he continued his tale, the recruits hanging on to his every word. With Pixis dead and our ships in tatters, we had no choice. We had to hunker down on that God-forsaken rock and pray for a miracle. He shook his head, remembering the grim days that followed. We salvaged what we could from the wrecks, set up a makeshift camp. It was a struggle just to survive, with the toxic air and hellish conditions. But as we picked through the ruins, we started finding things. Strange artifacts, bits of technology that didn't match anything we'd seen from the Nigians. Russell leaned forward, his eyes glinting. That's when Colonel Briggs got it in his head to go looking for the Colonizers. He figured if anyone had answers, it'd be them, so he put together a team, the best of the best, and set off into that blasted wasteland. He let out a low whistle, shaking his head. It was a hell of a journey, let me tell you. The planet was coming apart at the seams, and every step was a gamble. Sinkholes that could swallow a man whole, vents spewing poison gas, quakes that'd knock you off your feet. But Briggs, he wouldn't be deterred. Russell's voice dropped to a whisper. Weeks they spent out there combing through the desolation. Just when they were about to give up, they found it, hidden away in a network of lava tubes, so deep underground you'd never know it was there. He paused, letting the anticipation build. The Colonizer city. And let me tell you, it was a sight to behold. Towering spires of gleaming metal, gardens filled with glowing crystals, technology that made our best gear look like stone axes. It was like something out of a dream. He closed his eyes as if trying to block out the memory. The Colonizers, or what was left of them, their bodies strewn throughout the city, mummified by the dry air. It was like they'd all just died, all at once. No signs of a struggle, no wounds, just an entire civilization snuffed out in an instant. Out. Russell fell silent, the weight of the discovery hanging in the air. The recruits shifted uneasily, their minds racing with the implications. "But that wasn't the worst of it," Russell said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, the real horror was yet to come, because as Briggs and his team delved deeper into the city, into the very heart of the Colonizers' last refuge, they found something else. Something that would change everything we thought we knew about the Nigeans, the Colonizers, and ourselves." He looked up, his eyes haunted, and the recruits knew they were about to hear a truth that would shake them to their very core. Russell's voice was barely a whisper as he revealed the next horrifying twist in the tale. In the very center of the city, in a vast chamber that pulsed with an eerie green light, they found it. A machine, ancient and alien, covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and twist before their eyes. And at its heart, suspended in a web of crackling energy, was a creature unlike anything they'd ever seen. He shuddered, the memory still raw. It was massive, a tangle of pulsating flesh and gleaming metal, with dozens of eyes that glowed with a sickly, intelligent light. And when it spoke, its voice echoing through their minds like a thunderclap, they knew they were in the presence of something truly alien. Russell leaned forward, his face gaunt. It called itself the Overseer, and it claimed to be the true master of the Nigeans, the Colonizers, and countless other species across the galaxy. It said it had been manipulating them for eons, guiding their evolution, their wars, their very fates, all for some grand cosmic game beyond our understanding. He shook his head, as if trying to dislodge the memory. Briggs, he tried to reason with it, to understand, but the Overseer, it just laughed, a sound that made their blood run cold. It said we were just another pawn in its game, that our struggle against the Nigeans had been orchestrated from the start, all to bring us to this moment. Russell's voice grew ragged, his hands trembling. And then it showed them the truth. The Nigeans, the Colonizers, they were just the beginning. The Overseer had seeded the galaxy with life, with intelligent species, all to serve as pieces on some vast, incomprehensible board. And Earth humanity, we were next. He fell silent, the weight of the revelation crushing. The recruits sat in stunned disbelief, their minds reeling from the implications. Russell looked up, his eyes haunted. Briggs, he made a decision then. He knew if the Overseer was allowed to continue to spread its influence to Earth, it would mean the end of everything we knew, everything we were. So he gave the order. His voice dropped to a whisper. They overloaded the machine, sent a surge of energy through its core. The Overseer, it screamed, a sound that shattered their minds, even as the chamber around them began to collapse. They ran, then, through the crumbling city. As the planet itself heaved and buckled, the Overseer's dying throes tearing it apart. Russell closed his eyes, the memory still vivid. They barely made it back to the ships, the ground crumbling beneath their feet, and as they watched from orbit, the planet, it just came apart, like a rotten fruit. The Overseer, the Nigeans, the Colonizers, all of them gone in an instant, buried beneath the rubble of a shattered world. He looked up, his gaze haunted. But even as we fled, even as we made the long journey back to Earth, we knew it wasn't over. The Overseer, it was just one piece of the puzzle, one player in a game that spanned the stars, and out there, in the vast reaches of the galaxy, there were others. Other ancient alien intelligences, moving pieces on a board we couldn't even begin to comprehend. Russell fell silent, his tale at an end. The recruits sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them like a physical force. Russell's voice trembled as he described the macabre scene that greeted Colonel Briggs and his team in the heart of the Colonizer city. Once a thriving metropolis, it was now a mausoleum, the ancient streets and buildings carpeted with the desiccated remains of its former inhabitants. "Imagine it," Russell said, his eyes distant. "A city of the dead stretching out before them, skeletons everywhere, picked clean by time and the planet's corrosive atmosphere. It was like something out of a nightmare." As the explorers delved deeper, carefully picking their way through the eerie necropolis, they uncovered the chilling truth behind the Kelnorians' demise. The evidence was there, in the crumbling laboratories and decaying databanks. The Nigians, in a final act of cruelty, had unleashed a bioengineered plague upon the city, a virulent strain designed to exterminate the Kelnorian race. "The Nigians didn't just conquer them," Russell said, his voice thick with revulsion. "They annihilated them, wiped them out with a designer disease, tailor-made to shred their genetic code like tissue paper. Imagine watching your loved ones, your entire species, melt away before your eyes, powerless to stop it." But even in the face of this unimaginable horror, the Kelnorians had refused to submit. In a last desperate gambit, they had constructed a vast underground vault filled with thousands of stasis pods, a final refuge where they could sleep away the centuries, waiting for the day when they could reclaim their world. "You have to admire their tenacity," Russell said softly. "Even with their world crumbling around them, they refused to give up. They had faith that one day they would wake to a better future." But that day never came. As Russell revealed, his voice heavy with sorrow, the humans' own actions had sealed the Kelnorians' fate. The seismic upheaval triggered by the Nigianium device had ruptured the vault, destroying the delicate stasis pods and the dreamers within. "We killed them," Russell said, his voice barely a whisper. "Twice over, first by driving them into those pods and then by shattering their only hope of survival." In the stunned silence that followed, Russell seemed to gather himself. He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a sudden intensity. "But that's not the end of it," he said. "No, the real kick in the teeth, Briggs and his team picking through the wreckage, they found something, one pod, still intact among the thousands of broken shells, and inside, sleeping like some sort of twisted Snow White." "A girl," Russell said finally, "a Kelnorian child perfectly preserved, the last of her kind, the sole survivor of a twice-dead race, and as Briggs stood there staring down at her peaceful face, he knew that everything had changed. The game had shifted, the players had changed, and the fate of the galaxy itself hung in the balance." Russell's voice grew soft as he recounted the moment Colonel Briggs made the fateful decision to awaken the young Kelnorian girl from her stasis pod. The chamber was deathly silent, the air heavy with anticipation, as Briggs keyed in the release sequence. With a hiss of escaping gas, the pod cracked open, revealing the small, fragile form within. Lyraxia, as she called herself, emerged slowly, blinking in the harsh light. Her large, luminous eyes widened as they took in the humans gathered around her, their faces a mix of wonder and apprehension. At first, Russell explained, Lyraxia was understandably frightened and confused. She had gone to sleep in a world where her people were fighting a losing war against the Nigians, only to wake up to find that everything she had known was gone. As Briggs and his team gently explained what had happened, the Nigians' bioweapon, the centuries that had passed, and the humans' own role in the planet's upheaval, Lyraxia's fear gave way to grief, and then, gradually, to a tentative hope. Despite her reservations, Lyraxia recognized that the humans, for all their flaws, represented her best chance at rebuilding some semblance of her lost civilization. In exchange for their help, she agreed to share her knowledge of the planet's unique geology and her people's advanced technology, which had survived in the city's databanks. In the months that followed, Russell recounted, the humans and Lyraxia worked tirelessly to establish a new settlement on the planet's surface. It was a daunting task, given the harsh environment and the constant threat of aftershocks and toxic gas leaks. But with Lyraxia's guidance and the humans' resourcefulness, they slowly began to make progress. They salvaged what they could from the wreckage of the human ships and the Kelnorian city, repurposing materials to construct sturdy shelters and power generators. They tapped into underground water sources and established hydroponic farms, ensuring a steady supply of food and clean water. But the challenges they faced weren't just environmental. The few remaining Nigean survivors, embittered by their defeat and the destruction of their homeworld, saw the alliance between the humans and Lyraxia as the ultimate betrayal. They launched guerrilla attacks on the fledgling settlement, sabotaging equipment and attempting to assassinate key leaders. Through it all, though, the bond between the humans and Lyraxia only grew stronger. Working side by side day after day, they came to appreciate each other's strengths and forgive each other's weaknesses. Russell spoke of how Lyraxia's quiet wisdom and the humans' stubborn determination complemented each other perfectly, allowing them to overcome obstacles that would have crushed either group alone. As the settlement grew and prospered, so too did the trust and friendship between its inhabitants. The humans and Lyraxia began to see each other not as aliens, but as partners in a shared struggle for survival and rebirth. Together, they were laying the foundation for a new society, one that combined the best of both their cultures. But even as they celebrated their hard-won victories, Russell's voice took on a note of foreboding. For out in the vast reaches of space, a new threat was stirring, an ancient, malevolent intelligence drawn by the planet's upheaval and the sudden silence of the Overseer. As it drew near, the humans and Lyraxia remained oblivious, too focused on their immediate challenges to sense the gathering storm. But Russell knew, with a terrible certainty, that their greatest test was yet to come. A test that would push their newfound alliance to its breaking point and determine the fate not just of their world, but of the galaxy itself. The recruits leaned forward, hanging onto Russell's every word, as he paused to take a long, slow drink from his flask. The grizzled explorer's eyes gleamed in the flickering light, and they knew that the true heart of his tale was just beginning to unfold. Russell's eyes narrowed as he described the day the Zarkoth ship descended from the heavens, its massive bulk blotting out the sun. The colonists watched in awe and fear as the sleek black vessel settled on the outskirts of their settlement, its hull gleaming in the eerie light of the twin moons. "We had no idea what to expect," Russell said, his voice tight with tension. "We'd faced down the Nigeans, survived the destruction of a planet, but this was something else entirely." He described how the ship's ramp lowered with a hiss of hydraulics, revealing a delegation of tall, slender beings. Their skin was a pale, iridescent blue, their eyes a deep, penetrating violet. They moved with an eerie grace, their steps fluid and precise. "The Zarkoth, they called themselves," Russell continued, "said they were an ancient race, been watching this planet for centuries, waiting for the right moment to make contact." He recounted how the Zarkoth leader, a towering figure named Zandros, approached the colonists with an offer that sounded too good to be true. The Zarkoth, Zandros claimed, were a technologically advanced race, capable of wonders the humans could scarcely imagine. In exchange for access to the planet's rare minerals and the secrets of Kelnorian tech, they'd provide the colonists with advanced weapons, medical knowledge, terraforming capabilities, everything they'd need to tame this hostile world. Colonel Briggs and Lyraxia, they weren't sure what to make of it at first, Russell said, but the more they talked, the more tempting it sounded. An alliance with a race that powerful, it could change everything. But as the negotiations progressed, Russell's voice grew heavy with foreboding. He described how Zandros's demands became more and more outrageous: control of the planet's defense systems, unlimited access to the Kelnorian stasis chambers, even a say in how the colony was governed. "It was like a mask slipping away," Russell murmured. "Beneath all that talk of friendship and alliance, there was something else, something cold and calculating." He leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "I remember the moment it all fell apart. Zandros was pushing for more control, more concessions. Briggs finally put his foot down, said there were lines we wouldn't cross." Russell's voice dropped to a whisper. "That's when Zandros smiled. It was a terrible thing, that smile, like a predator baring its teeth." He shook his head, his expression grim. "That's when we realized what we were dealing with. The Zarkoth, they weren't just another spacefaring race. They were something else entirely, something ancient and powerful and utterly ruthless. As the recruits listened with rapt attention, Russell's voice rose with tension. But Briggs and Lyraxia, they weren't fooled by the Zarkoth's honeyed words. They knew something was off, something sinister lurking beneath that veneer of cooperation. He leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the dim light. They started digging, poking around the Zarkoth ship when no one was looking, and that's when they found it, a hidden laboratory deep in the bowels of the vessel. Russell's voice grew harsh, disgust etched into every word. What they saw in there, it was the stuff of nightmares. Nigan prisoners, strapped to tables, screaming as the Zarkoth scientists cut into them. They were using them as guinea pigs, splicing their DNA, trying to create some kind of super soldier. He shook his head, his face pale at the memory. Briggs, he nearly lost his lunch right there, but Lyraxia, she figured it out. The Zarkoth, they weren't here to help us. They were using us, using the planet as a testing ground for their new weapon. Russell's fist clenched, his knuckles white. They wanted to perfect it, then unleash it on the galaxy, conquer every world, enslave every species, and we were just the first step. A grim smile played at the corners of his mouth. So they came up with a plan, a desperate gamble, but it was all we had. Russell's eyes took on a faraway look as he recounted the fateful day. They called a meeting, invited Xandros and his top brass down into the Kellanorian city, said they wanted to finalize the agreement, hand over control. He let out a humorless chuckle. The Zarkoth, they were so arrogant, so sure of themselves, they walked right into the trap. Russell's voice grew tense, his words coming faster. The moment they were inside, deep in the heart of the city, Briggs gave the signal. The human and Kellanorian forces, they came out of hiding, sealed off every exit. The Zarkoth were trapped, like rats in a maze. He leaned back, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. And then we hit them with it. The city's defense systems, ancient weapons the Kellanorians had built to protect themselves. An electromagnetic pulse, targeted right at the Zarkoth. Russell snapped his fingers, the sound echoing in the stillness. Just like that, their tech was fried. Weapons, communications, everything. They were helpless, stripped of their advantage. But then his voice grew somber, his eyes haunted. But the Zarkoth, they didn't go down easy. They fought like cornered beasts, lashing out with tooth and claw. Our forces, they took heavy losses. Good men and women, human and Kellanorian alike, falling to the aliens' desperate rage. Russell closed his eyes, pain etched into his features. It was a bloodbath, a brutal close-quarters slaughter in those ancient tunnels. But in the end, we prevailed. The Zarkoth, every last one of them, lay dead at our feet. He fell silent, the weight of the memory hanging in the air. After a long moment he spoke again, his voice heavy with emotion. Russell fell silent, his eyes haunted by the memories of that fateful day. The recruits sat in stunned disbelief, the weight of the revelation crushing them like a physical force. After a long moment Russell spoke again, his voice heavy with emotion. But that wasn't the end of it. No, the real nightmare was just beginning. He described how in the aftermath of the battle, the human and Kellanorian forces had combed through the wreckage of the Zarkoth ship, searching for any clues about their true intentions. And that's when they found it, hidden deep within the ship's core. A transmission, a message from the Zarkoth's masters. Russell's voice grew tense, his words coming faster. The Zarkoth, they were just the beginning. A scouting party sent to test our defenses. And we'd failed. We'd shown them that we were a threat, a challenge to their power. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into the recruits. The transmission, it was from something called the Caraxian Dominion, an empire, vast and ancient, spanning countless worlds. And they were coming for the planet, for the technology, for us. Russell's fist clenched, his knuckles white. The Dominion, they didn't take kindly to failure. The Zarkoth's defeat had sealed our fate. The transmission made it clear they would come, and they would show no mercy. They would burn our cities, shatter our armies, and enslave our people, all in the name of their twisted vision of order. After a long moment, Russell spoke again, his voice heavy with resignation. We had no choice. The planet, the Kelnorian tech, it was all lost to us now. If we stayed, if we fought, we'd be wiped out. The Dominion's forces were too strong, too numerous. He described how the human and Kelnorian leaders had made the decision, the only decision they could. Evacuation, abandonment. They would load their ships with whatever they could carry, whatever technology and resources they'd managed to salvage, and they would flee. Flee into the dark of space, searching for safety, for allies, for some way to fight back against the coming storm. He shook his head as if trying to dislodge the memory. Colonel Briggs and Lyraxia, they knew we had to buy time. The fleet, it was vulnerable, slow. If the Dominion caught us in open space, it would be a slaughter, so they hatched a plan, a desperate gamble. Russell's voice dropped to a whisper. They took a handful of ships, the fastest, the most heavily armed. Volunteers, all of them, knowing it was a one-way trip. They'd act as a decoy, a distraction, try to lead the Dominion away from the main fleet. He closed his eyes, pain etched across his face. I watched them go, watched their ships disappear into the void. Briggs, Lyraxia, some of the best damn soldiers and pilots I've ever known. They knew the odds, knew they weren't coming back. But they went anyway, because that's what heroes do. Russell fell silent, the weight of the memory bearing down on him. The recruit sat motionless, scarcely breathing, the fate of those brave few hanging in the air. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.